we're going to go into demographics. So the different ways that society tends to be stratified. So the first one that I wanted to talk about was age. So the age stratification theory suggests that age is a way of regulating behavior of a generation. And so, different generations have different behaviors. And so we're going to go into the main generations to know. I would say, so this first one, always on generation, which is anyone born 2010 and after, is something that I guess I didn't really learn about during the time when I was studying, but I guess this is a extra point to know, just in case it had like they added a new term. So always on generation is anyone born 2010 and above, and Generation Z is anyone born between 1996 and 2010. A common acronym that, or a way to remember it, they sometimes have is the kids who love their Sony Xperia Z phones. So Generation Z for those Sony Xperia Z phones. For Generation Y, they're also known as millennials. They were born between 1981 and 1995. The way to remember it is that's us. I guess I'm not completely sure how. Personally, I kind of just remembered them by like each of the age stratifications on their own. But if that's us, like helps for the millennials, then that's a way to remember it. Generation X are those born between 1965 and 1980. So the way they refer to it is the 70s loved drugs, which is also known as ecstasy. So X for Generation X. The baby boomers were those born between 1946 and 1964 and are now considered a large population in the United States. And they should be around up to like the 60s by this time. And they grew up in the post-World War II periods and are currently leaving the workforce because of their age. Before that was the silent generation, which were those born between 1925 and 1945, which were born during the Great Depression. And so silent grandfather associated with that silent generation. And the GI or greatest generation are those born between 1901 and 1924, which are the oldest people alive today. And they were born during the first quarter of the 20th century. So acronym or the way to remember it is your great grandfather. So great grandfather, greatest generation. Your grandfather would probably be the oldest people in your family at this time. And then these are just like a infographic of, some different communication methods for each of the generations that are commonly, I guess, associated with it. But in terms of the MCAT, sometimes they might have like a discrete question that just asks about like, what generation would these type of individuals be? I would say is usually rare, but just something to keep in mind for age. And then the other common stratification method is through race and ethnicity. So race is a socially defined category based on physical differences between groups of people. The racial formation theory looks at social, economic, and political forces that result in racially constructed identities. So the most common races that I've looked up from the US Census this past year that they identify people by is like white or European American, Black or African American, Asian American, American Indian or Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian / Pacific Islander. And on the other hand, ethnicity is a socially defined category based on shared language, religion, nationality, history, and some other cultural factor as well. So ethnicity is a little less statistically defined than the racial groups above, and their definitions can also change over time. And a minority group, so within ethnicity is a group that makes up less than half the total population and is treated differently due to some characteristic. This varies between each of the different like groups. And the main ethnicity that the US Census also defines currently is Hispanic or Latino and not Hispanic or Latino for the main groups. And then due to race and ethnicity, there are a lot of discrimination, prejudice, stereotypes, genocide, assimilation differences between all of these, different groups in different aspects of like healthcare, education, wealth, income, and many more. Actually, we're going to be going more into like discrimination, prejudice, and stereotypes in next week's lecture, where we kind of go a little deeper on like how to differentiate between some of these terms and also like what are some common ones, but that's for next week. So this week is just recognizing these stratifications. And then another group that they separate individuals between are like for immigration, so immigrants versus not. And immigrants tend to face, very severe challenges when arriving to a new country. Many times people do want to help them, but are also wary of their different cultures and customs of immigrants, which ends up making it hard for many to communicate with them sometimes, and also, get along with them. And immigration, so I guess one of the reasons for immigration is because it can alleviate labor shortages in other countries. But then at the same time, it can also decrease the strain on their home economy that cannot quite support the large population. So it's a benefit for both the other country and their home country. But at the same time, immigrants can also be exploited by other countries too, depending on like how they treat these immigrants when they come to their new country. So that's I guess two sides to that. And also race and ethnicity, like we mentioned before, tend to be a cause for, biased policies and different expectations for people based on like their social interactions and socially defined laws in a sense. So one example here is in 1986 when the US passed the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which forbade hiring of illegal immigrants. But they extended the amnesty and legal status to illegal immigrants that were already in the US at that time. So there are also other policies that encourage families of immigrants to move or keep money in their local economy instead of having, immigrants send their families money from the new country that they're in. So these are just some challenges for migration. We will also probably go a little more into that next week in terms of like assimilation. And then the other separation, stratification in a population is by sex, gender, and also sexual orientation. So these terms are all interconnected and also important individually. So I'll be defining each of them in here, but they're also considered independent of each other. So sex is what most sociologists consider biological. Actually, probably also biologists, but anyway, the most common, ways to divide sex into is through male or female. So the XY sex chromosome for males and XX sex chromosomes for female. However, sex is also not considered binary. So there are different, chromosome combinations that could potentially lead to different, in a sense, like ways to characterize them biologically. And so that's why we say it's not binary at the moment. And because, there are these intersex people that have 1 or 3 plus so of, these sex chromosomes. So they tend to express different sex characteristics. And gender, on the other hand, is how one person would identify, how one person expresses their identity and also just like expresses themselves. And it's a social construction that is not quite fixed or an innate fact like sex, where it's biological, but instead varies across time and place. So the categories of gender are fluid, and it's also subject to social processes of, meaning making, and it's also not binary. It Gender tends to also influence roles and norms, which can lead to, like stereotypes, prejudice, those kind of behavioral terms as mentioned before with race and ethnicity. And there are also like categories of cisgender, which is when both the biological sex and an individual's gender identity is the same, and also transgender, where the biological sex and the gender identity of an individual don't match. So those are the groups within gender. And then sexual orientation is related to attraction and fornication. So this is not dependent on sex or gender. And this is because, you could potentially be attracted to any gender or no gender. And there are all these different combinations that there are. And, some examples are like, I guess the most common, not exactly most common, but I guess the original norm was that most people would be heterosexual, but then also there is also those that are homosexual, bisexual, queer, asexual, pansexual, also like a bunch more other terms that can be looked up on if you want to learn more. Yep. And then the other area that people also can be stratified by are income classes. So income class is separated by, the upper class, which is very wealthy businessmen and family wealth, middle class, which are professionals that tend to have better paying jobs, but are not quite up to that upper class level, and then lower class, which are manual work. They perform manual work, labor, and tend to be in low paying jobs. So the way that we kind of divide groups between like the rich, upper middle class, lower middle class, and poor and near poor is kind of dependent a little bit on like inflation, and also like what the minimum amount is for supporting a family. But in 2019, for a family of 3, these were the values for how to separate people based on these groups. And so this is just like, I would suggest that probably best if you can look up the time period that's closest to, like the time period to separate all of these groups closest to when you're taking your exams, so that would be the most representative of like the population that most of the questions should be geared towards, if they are to talk about like stratifying people by income class. And then it's also important to know how class may affect individuals in society regarding healthcare, education, and opportunities, and more. So it tends to be the case that the upper class, as you go higher up in the class, actually, the healthcare treatment tends to be better. They also tend to have more opportunities for education, and also, other types of opportunities, whether it be like finding job, internship opportunities, or just, being able to do a bunch more things, as opposed to maybe mainly focusing on paying the bills and taking care of their family. So, and then the other aspect that can also stratify people is actually by geographic area. And so this is in terms of like the urban, suburban, or rural areas. So in urban areas considered cities or towns with over 1,000 people per square mile, and a city tends to also have over 50,000 people. Metropolises have over 500,000 people. So really packed areas. And a suburban area are residential communities that are located outside of city centers that are usually relatively homogeneous in terms of like the population of the people who live there. And it's usually between the amount of 100,000 to 250,000 people. And then rural areas are those that have less than 1,000 people per square mile. So the common ways to think of this as like a farm country or somewhere like Alaska, it has to have less than 25,000 residents in order to be considered rural. And another thing that I guess another term that the MCAT likes to test on a lot is with urbanization. So moving of people from these rural areas to the urban areas that began during the Industrial Revolution in order to find work or housing because of the technological advancements of like those urban areas, but that also led to jobs lost on farms. So people needed to go instead to these urban areas to find work and pay for their families. And so some pros of this is the wide variety of culture to get, different perspectives and understand all of this. They also, most people have more anonymity in a big city. There are also more job opportunities and more options or services for education, healthcare, and many other services for the general population. The cons tend to be that there is more crowding because of like the very small space, even though there are so many people packed in that area. And also, it's worth it to note that urban areas are host to more crimes and sources of inequality. So sometimes a question may come up where they ask like, oh, which of these areas is it most likely to, is there most likely to be a murder? Then out of those choices, you would most likely pick one that is in urban area or at least describes an urban area. Yes. And then continuing on, so on top of urbanization, there's suburbanation, which is the movement away from cities to get a larger home. And suburbs actually form their own economic centers and also become independent to the cities they border. Usually, like that will be the time when commutes for the individuals in these suburb areas get longer because they're much farther away from the city than they were originally. And then another thing is gentrification, which is when, I guess it would most likely be like city officials or those responsible for the geographic areas that decide to revamp or improve and make old parts of the cities even better or just make it better in general. This ends up attracting, I guess, more, or because of the work that they are doing in these cities, it tends to increase the property value of living there. And so it tends to be that more wealthy people enter those areas that are gentrified, and then it causes poorer people to be pushed out because they can't pay for that high property value. Also, slums are considered heavily populated urban informal settlements that are characterized by substandard housing that lack reliable sanitation services and a supply of clean water. So just very, in a sense, bad conditions for even though they are in this urban setting. And then a ghetto is considered an area where specific racial, ethnic, or religious minorities are concentrated. And this is usually due to social or economic inequities between that minority group. So this is just a demonstration of like an urban area, a suburban area, I would say, and then the rural areas here. And also another thing that's important to know is the demographic transition model. So this goes in different stages to kind of, it's to characterize like different countries and what stages of this like demographic transition they are in currently. So stage 1 is considered when that population has a high birth rate and also a high death rate. And so the reasons for high birth rate tend to be that they, have limited birth control because they're, usually in the earlier stages, I would say it's more of like a country that's still developing and trying to get the hang of things. So they have limited resources. And so one, limited birth control, which contributes to that high birth rate. And then also the high death rate because of disease and poor nutrition in that population. But both of these high values ends up leading to like the stable population. So it creates this kind of like pointy triangle at the top. And stage 2, so what happens in stage 2 is that the death rate decreases because of more food availability and also because of an improvement in health and sanitation. It still has that high birth rate, but because of this, death rate decrease, it causes population growth, which creates this triangle that's more like rounded out on the sides in a sense. And then stage 3 is when also with the death rate decreasing, there's also a birth rate that decreases because of their access to things like birth control, which leads to a slower population growth. So this rounded thing here. But although there is a slower population growth, the individuals in the population tend to have longer lives. So they can live to that higher, more people can live higher than that age of 65 here, you can see. And then for stage 4, this is when both birth rate and death rate are low, and it tends to be that more people have a focus on career. So like for women, they might not be reproducing as much as they did maybe in the earlier stages. And it tends to be that the population stabilizes. So you can see here, these are quite like, in a sense, like continuing on. So as this continues on a little bit, because of the lower birth rate, there's a slightly less, like it goes in here on the sides of the amount of individuals being born. And then stage 5 is still like a speculation right now. But the speculation is based on the Malthusian theorem, which is that eventually populations will tend to run out of resources and there will be global food shortage, and we won't be able to exactly maintain natural resources for everyone on the planet. And so that would cause like a certain threshold for the population to exist, but past that, probably there would be limits to even reaching a level past that threshold. So now we're gonna go into the first question for this session. So we have here 100% saying D. So I'm gonna exit and continue. So you guys got it. The answer is D. And just quick run through. So the scientist wants to analyze the demographics of his subjects. And so which of these, which I mentioned earlier on throughout our presentations, all the different ways, could he use, or could she use in this demographics research? And as we spoke about, like age, the different generations, income level, the different classes, and also sexuality, different types of sexuality, are all different ways that this researcher can definitely use for her demographics research. And we're going to go on for another question. And this should be the last question of tonight. So we have here 50% saying C and 50% saying D. So there is a little bit of a split here. So the answer here is C. Because of the split, I recognize that there is probably a little bit of a confusion. So let me see. In this, it says the question says, in a graph, we see that a population has a decreasing birth rate and a decreasing death rate. What stage of the demographic transition is this population in? And so I think it's, first of all, great that all of you guys recognize that, both stage 3 and stage 4 are on those lower ends of both a birth rate and a death rate. So that's why for stage 1 and stage 2, those are incorrect answers. But for the difference between stage 3 and stage 4 is that stage 3 is like that point where the birth rates and death rates are still like decreasing. For stage 4, we already would have to know that the birth rate and death rate are considered low. So they have been maintained as being that low level for a while, as opposed to just like decreasing. Which is why choice C, stage 3, is the correct answer here.